At 11:32 on November 29, 1943, at 24,000 feet over northern Germany, the tail of a B-17 flying fortress shuddered as flak bursts walked closer through thin air. Inside that narrow compartment, wrapped in sub-zero cold and engine vibration, the bomber named Ricky Tikitavi pushed on toward Bremen, its aluminum skin already scarred by black bursts hanging in the sky. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran, 19 years old, lean from farm work in Wisconsin, knelt alone at the very end of the aircraft as the B-17 tail gunner, straddling a bicycle seat behind twin .50 caliber machine guns. That morning, the 8th Air Force had sent more than 300 bombers against Bremen's shipyards and aircraft factories, and German defenses had already destroyed 6 flying fortresses in the first hour. For weeks, crews like Moran's had watched friends fail to return, knowing the math was cruel. 25 missions to go home. 15 missions on average to be lost, with some groups losing half their aircraft each month. The tail gunner's position was the loneliest on any bomber, 40 feet from the nearest crewman, guarding the one approach German pilots preferred because only one man could fire back. As the formation turned for England, a flak burst struck Ricky Tikitavi's No. 2 engine, and the bomber began to slow slipping out of the protective box with no fighter escort anywhere in sight. Below and behind, German fighters were already climbing engines, howling through the cold, closing the distance on a wounded aircraft that could not hide. If the B-17 tail gunner failed now, nothing else could save them. What do you do when the sky gives way? By late November 1943, the air war over Europe had entered its most punishing phase, and nowhere was that clearer than over northern Germany. The 8th Air Force was deep into its daylight strategic bombing campaign, sending unescorted bomber formations straight into the heart of the Reich to break German industry from the air. Bremen sat high on that target list, an industrial city along the Weser River, packed with shipyards, aircraft factories, and submarine construction facilities that fed Germany's war at sea and in the air. Every successful strike here slowed U-boat production, delayed fighter deliveries, and forced Germany to divert resources from the front lines to home defense. To reach Bremen, American bombers had to fly hundreds of miles over hostile territory, climbing to altitudes above 20,000 feet, where thin air, brutal cold, and fatigue worked against every crewman. The bombing doctrine was rigid, but necessary: tight defensive box formations, overlapping fields of fire, and straight-level flight during the bomb run to ensure accuracy. That same discipline made the bombers predictable targets. German defenders layered their response opening with heavy flak belts around major cities before turning fighter groups loose on damaged or isolated aircraft. A B-17 that stayed inside the formation had a chance. A B-17 that slipped behind it did not. By November, losses had reached catastrophic levels. 2 months earlier, a single mission to Schweinfurt had cost the 8th Air Force 60 flying fortresses. In one day, more than 600 airmen killed in action or captured before nightfall. Crews understood the odds without needing them explained. They called these deep missions milk runs to hell, dark humor, masking the reality that statistics, not courage, often decided who came home. For every formation that turned back toward England, German fighter controllers watched carefully, marking the stragglers whose engines smoked or whose speed fell just a few knots short. Those bombers would be hit again, and when they were, the fight would no longer be about strategy or industry or the shape of the war. It would come down to one aircraft, one angle of approach, and one gunner, holding the last line of defense. Eugene Moran did not look like the kind of man most people imagined when they pictured an American airman over Germany. He was 19 years old, lean rather than muscular, a dairy farm boy from Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, who had spent more time milking cows than throwing punches. Before the war, his world had been narrow and familiar: early mornings, cold barns, and watching aircraft pass overhead while he worked the fields. When he enlisted the day he turned 18, the Army Air Forces did not see a future legend. They saw a young man with steady hands, good eyesight, and the quiet patience that came from farm work, exactly the traits needed for a B-17 tail gunner. Training taught him the mechanics of survival. Identify a Messerschmitt Bf 109. or a Focke-Wulf 190 by silhouette alone lead a fast-moving target by instinct fire in short bursts to keep barrels from overheating. He memorized angles, distances, and closing speeds, learning how a fighter looked at 2,000 yards and how quickly it could be on top of him. What training could not teach was what it felt like to do all of that while sealed inside an unheated metal tube at minus 40 degrees, breathing through an oxygen mask as cannon shells tore through aluminum. The tail gunner's responsibility was brutally simple. If attackers came from directly behind, he was the only thing standing between the bomber and destruction. Moran understood that reality even on his first mission, because on a B-17, there was no backup for the man in the tail. If he failed, the aircraft would be hit where it could not survive. That belief stayed with him as Ricky Tikitavi crossed the German coast engines, droning flak bursting closer and fighters beginning to gather below. He did not yet know how much that belief would demand from him before the day was over. The first warning came as a subtle change in sound. As Ricky Tikitavi turned away from Bremen, the steady rhythm of 4 engines faltered, one propeller slipping into an uneven windmill that vibrated through the airframe. A flak burst had punched into the number 2 engine, and the bomber began to lose speed just a few knots at first, then more. Inside the defensive box, that was enough. The formation pulled ahead while Moran's aircraft lagged behind, the overlapping fields of fire thinning until the sky around them felt suddenly open and exposed. Below the bomber, dark specks began to rise through the haze. German fighters. They came in organized waves, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, climbing from low 6 o'clock, while Focke-Wulf 19s rolled down from above engines, screaming as they converted altitude into speed. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate and tracked the first attacker through his sights. He squeezed the triggers and both .50 calibers came alive, tracers arcing backward through the thin air. The fighter broke off at the last second, rolling away with smoke streaming from its engine. But there was no pause. Another pair replaced it immediately, one drawing Moran's fire, while the second slid into position for a clean shot at the tail. Spent brass piled around Moran's knees as he swung his guns from target to target, firing in short, controlled bursts, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The temperature inside the tail section hovered near minus 40 degrees, and his breath froze into crystals on the edge of his oxygen mask. The guns grew hot. His fingers went numb. The German pilots knew their trade. They ignored the fuselage and aimed for what mattered: engines, first gunners, second stripping the bomber of speed and teeth, before moving in for the kill. Cannon rounds punched through the aircraft with a sound like tearing canvas vibrations running through the tail section with every impact. Somewhere forward, one of the waist guns fell silent. Then the other. The intercom dissolved into static and half-formed shouts that cut off as abruptly as they began. Moran kept firing. A Focke-Wulf flashed across his sights at the 4 o'clock position, too close, too fast, and Moran instinctively led the target and fired. The fighter's wing disintegrated under the impact, and it spiraled downward, trailing black smoke. His first confirmed kill. There was no time to register it. A burst of cannon fire ripped through the tail section, slamming into Moran's arms with blunt force that stole his breath and sent heat and pain racing through his body. Blood soaked into his flight suit sleeves, but his hands still closed around the grips, and the guns stayed on target. Another hit shattered the vertical stabilizer above him, snapping control cables that whipped through the compartment like steel lashes. The aircraft began to vibrate violently. Moran glanced down at the parachute strapped to his chest, the last guarantee every airman carried into combat. There were holes torn clean through the silk canopy. More than one. His parachute was useless. Outside, at least 15 German fighters circled the wounded bomber patient and methodical, waiting for it to finish dying. Inside, Moran was running out of blood, out of feeling in his fingers, and out of time. And then the vibration changed again. This time, it was not an engine. It was the aircraft itself. The sound came without warning. Not flak, not cannon fire. It was the shriek of metal tearing under its own weight. Moran felt the vibration surge through the tail section as the airframe finally gave up the fight it had been losing for minutes. A grinding jolt ran beneath his boots, followed by a sudden impossible lightness as if the aircraft had inhaled and never exhaled again. Through the torn skin of the fuselage, he watched the front of Ricky Tikitavi separate and fall away, wings and engines, breaking free and tumbling toward the gray patchwork of Germany far below. The bomber was no longer an airplane. It was two pieces falling through empty sky. Moran was still alive. He was wounded in both arms, strapped into a severed tail section with no functioning parachute and no control over what came next. The laws of physics were clear. At 24,000 feet, there was no margin left. German fighters circled the wreckage cautious now, watching the falling tail as if unsure what they were seeing. Some drifted closer, too close. Moran pulled the guns back toward center, bracing himself against the steel plate as centrifugal force pressed him down, then flung him sideways. The tail section spun. The horizon vanished. Still his hands closed around the triggers. He fired. Tracer rounds tore out into space, arcing wildly as the wreckage rotated, forcing the fighters to scatter away from a target that should have been helpless. One aircraft took hits across its fuselage and broke off, diving hard toward the ground below. For a few seconds, that felt far longer. The only thing keeping the Germans at distance was a B-17 tail gunner who refused to stop doing his job. Then the spin slowed. The violent rotation eased into a rough, staggering fall as the tail's vertical and horizontal stabilizers caught the air, turning chaos into something barely controllable. Barely. Moran stayed locked behind the guns, watching the ground grow larger through torn metal and rushing wind. He did not look for an escape that did not exist. He did not let go. He kept firing until there was nothing left to threaten and nothing left to do but fall. The first impact came through the trees. The falling tail section struck the top of a pine at roughly 100 miles per hour, snapping branches thick as a man's arm and ripping away the vertical stabilizer in a spray of wood and aluminum. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding pieces with every violent rotation until it slammed into the frozen ground and stopped. Silence followed. Eugene Moran was still alive. Inside the crushed tail section, he lay pinned and unable to move, his body broken in ways no training manual could imagine. Both forearms were shattered, his ribs cracked and shifting with every breath. His head split open where torn metal had struck him, leaving part of his skull exposed to the freezing air. The crash site lay in a forest roughly 15 miles south of Bremen, deep inside enemy territory, surrounded by civilians who had just watched American bombs fall on their city. Moran tried to move. His legs answered weakly. His arms did not. Cold began to settle in the kind that seeps through bone and steals time, and he understood that surviving the fall meant nothing if he bled out or froze before help arrived. German soldiers reached the wreckage within the hour, rifles raised, staring at the American airman, who should not have been breathing. They searched him roughly, finding his ruined parachute, his dog tags, his rank, then left him lying in the snow while they examined the shattered tail section. An officer arrived and took one look at Moran's injuries before turning away, convinced the young gunner would not last the day. Orders were orders. Moran was loaded onto a wooden cart without a stretcher or blankets and hauled over frozen roads to a military facility, every jolt sending fresh pain through bones already broken. For 2 days, he lay on a concrete floor without medical treatment, drifting in and out of consciousness as infection set in and his wounds darkened in the cold. When he was finally transferred again, it was not because he was expected to live, but because dead prisoners provided no intelligence. At a small prisoner of war hospital, 2 Serbian doctors captured on the Eastern Front examined Moran and made a decision no one else would. They would try to save him. The surgery lasted 7 hours, performed with field instruments, almost no anesthesia, and supplies, never meant for injuries of that scale. They set his broken arms with wire and pins, cleaned infected tissue, and covered the exposed portion of his skull with a crude metal plate. When they finished, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would decide everything. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Against probability and expectation, Eugene Moran survived again. The bomber was gone. The crew was gone, but the tail gunner who fell 24,000 feet without a parachute was still breathing. Eugene Moran did not return home as a hero in the way movies imagine. After his survival in the German hospital, he spent the next 17 months as a prisoner of war moving through camps as the Reich collapsed around him. He survived starvation rations, overcrowded barracks, and a Baltic transport later remembered by prisoners as a floating hell, where men were packed below deck without light air or sanitation. In the winter of 1945, as Soviet forces closed in, Moran was forced onto what became known as the Black March, a brutal evacuation across frozen Germany. For 86 days, Allied airmen walked 15 to 20 miles a day through snow and sleet guarded by nervous soldiers with rifles and orders to shoot anyone who fell behind. An estimated 1,500 prisoners were lost along that road. Moran kept walking. When American forces intercepted the column near the Elbe River in April 1945, they found a man who weighed just 93 pounds, nearly 40% less than when he had enlisted. The Army documented his record with disbelief. Shot down over Bremen on November 29, 1943. Fell 24,000 feet without a parachute. Survived catastrophic injuries. Held as a prisoner of war for 17 months. Only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War are known to have survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes, all carried down by wreckage that slowed death just enough to leave room for chance. Moran received 2 Purple Hearts and Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster and an honorable discharge in December 1945. Then he went home. Back in Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, he married, raised a family, and returned to farming carrying pain that never fully left his body. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches for the rest of his life. His arms never regained their full strength, and the memories stayed locked away. For more than 60 years, Eugene Moran almost never spoke about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not even when asked. Silence was how he survived afterward. Only late in life did recognition begin to catch up. Wisconsin honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. A street in his hometown was named Eugene Moran Way. A teacher and historian spent years piecing together his story from records, witnesses, and interviews, finally breaking the quiet that had surrounded that November morning over Bremen. Eugene Moran passed away in 2014 at the age of 89. He outlived nearly his entire crew. He outlived the statistics that said he should not have made it through his first mission. And he left behind a story that almost disappeared not because it lacked meaning, but because men like him rarely asked to be remembered. If you are watching this, there is a good chance someone in your family carried something heavy like this and never spoke of it either. Tonight, ask them, listen carefully, and if this story mattered to you, help it reach someone who has never heard his name. Hit like so the algorithm carries it forward. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more true World War II stories about ordinary people forced into impossible moments. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and whether someone in your family served, so these memories stay alive instead of fading into silence. At 11:32 on November 29, 1943, at 24,000 feet over northern Germany, the tail of a B-17 flying fortress shuddered as flak bursts walked closer through thin air. Inside that narrow compartment, wrapped in sub-zero cold and engine vibration, the bomber named Ricky Tikitavi pushed on toward Bremen, its aluminum skin already scarred by black bursts hanging in the sky. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran, 19 years old, lean from farm work in Wisconsin, knelt alone at the very end of the aircraft as the B-17 tail gunner straddling a bicycle seat behind twin .50 caliber machine guns. That morning, the 8th Air Force had sent more than 300 bombers against Bremen's shipyards and aircraft factories, and German defenses had already destroyed 6 flying fortresses in the first hour. For weeks, crews like Moran's had watched friends fail to return, knowing the math was cruel. 25 missions to go home, 15 missions on average, to be lost with some groups losing half their aircraft each month. The tail gunner's position was the loneliest on any bomber, 40 feet from the nearest crewman, guarding the one approach German pilots preferred because only one man could fire back. As the formation turned for England, a flak burst struck Ricky Tikitavi's No. 2 engine, and the bomber began to slow, slipping out of the protective box with no fighter escort anywhere in sight. Below and behind, German fighters were already climbing engines, howling through the cold. closing the distance on a wounded aircraft that could not hide. If the B-17 tail gunner failed, now nothing else could save them. What do you do when the sky gives way?